Those that are either don't have the access and are poor because, you know, it's circumstance.
Yeah. I think that the most important starting point, and I'd like to really talk about the Facebook example. I mean, this was mentioned in the morning, and Gilani also stood up and said, you know, so many million people wrote to the Indian government, and where were the non-users at the table? I think it would behoove us very well to remember that when we spoke about girls' education 100 years ago in India, or about women's suffrage, the right to vote, a few decades ago in many countries, women were not at the table.
Yeah.
So I think the legitimacy of what becomes a very important issue in terms of communities, marginalized communities, remote populations, and people who are non-users at the moment, is to not start from the standpoint of are they at the table, but to actually frame the whole issue in a very ethical way. To frame the issue not in terms of is Facebook good, and who are we to moralize about, you know, internet.org or free basics. For me, it's not an issue of moralizing. For me, it's fundamentally a civilizational and social opportunity cost issue. Let me give you an analogy. How would it be if all the public schools in our respective countries had community canteens or school canteens that were serviced by McDonald's? You know, so the question is, I mean, even presuming that their burgers were completely organic, you know, that's a different thing. But my issue, therefore, is not to really say, you know, Salil in the, I think Samir in the first panel spoke about 93% actually using Facebook, and many of them believing that Facebook is default.
Yeah.
For me, the issue is that if that is the belief that the good internet is actually confined to Facebook, something is quite wrong with the imagination of those who are yet to be connected about what it means to be connected. And therefore, I think that of the innumerable rights that get implicated, there is the whole question of internet egalitarianism. There is not just the question of the equality of opportunity, but of equality of autonomy, you know, of the nature of knowledge and of being connected.
Yeah, I want to focus still on this issue of getting the voice of the voiceless heard and creating the structures that will enable the voice of the voiceless to be heard. And I want to bring it in the context of, I mean, governments obviously begin from the premise that their power is derived from the people. And therefore, they are formulating policy, it's coming from a democratic dispensation. At the same time, donors come in with specific, sometimes, specific requirements and ideas on how to do it. And in the middle, we have squeezed the voice of those without the platforms, nor the power, nor the understanding to help create the policy that would best suit them. Salil, do you want to comment?
Yeah, so I think there are lots of assumptions in what you just said, so I'd like to unpack those a little bit.
Okay.
Yes, some governments are democratic, some are not. Some governments that are democratic also know what's best for their people and don't let a large number of people who think differently to speak out. And it's not simply on big issues, but on even routine matters that they would do that. Similarly, companies, when they come in, they think what works best because it works in another country. They want to apply it here. Yeah. China is a big country, India is a big country, so what works in China must work in India. That's the kind of logic that goes with it. And even in civil society groups, we should all introspect a little bit. A lot of well-funded, well-organized civil society groups think that they know best because they are in the capitals, they come to the conferences like this, and they have a very clear idea of what to say on behalf of exactly the kind of people that Anita said who are not being heard about. So this whole, it's wonderful to have a multi-stakeholder way of developing policy and have the right people in the room, but we should always be very careful. They might be from different nationalities, they might be from different religions, they might have include all genders, but they might have all gone to Oxford, Cambridge and Harvard, for example. So I think the sheer diversity of views needed that makes it possible for people to have the views that matter is often lost.
So how do we use technology to get their voices?
Well, we need to first of all identify where they are. Now this is where the whole game becomes very interesting. That yes, greater internet access for everybody would probably make the people come up to the stage, and we will be able to identify where they are, and a large database will be created, and we will be able to bring them in. But everything has unintentional consequences. And in most societies, as soon as you grant greater access and people come out and identify themselves, it becomes very interesting for people who don't like them. And this includes another ethnic group, it includes another religious group, it might even include the government. If the government doesn't like people who speak language X, and there is a service being created specifically for people who speak X, it becomes very easy with modern database software for the people to find out, okay, these are the areas where the people who speak in X live, and then if there's a riot, they know where exactly to go next.
How have you dealt with it in Sepesa?
I think if there's a number of East Africans or Southern Africans in this room, they'll
I think there are
understand
lots
that,
of them.
yes, in our context, sometimes practice is what then informs the policies. So we've had a lot of instances where policy is from government is reactive either to historic events around genocide or the post-election violence in Kenya, or upcoming elections in Tanzania, or cultural issues around homosexuality in Uganda. What then happens is that the policies that are passed are in many cases regressive. We as civil society or as researchers try as much as possible to highlight the issues or the regressive provisions in these policies from two angles. One is obviously to inform advocacy by other like-minded organizations that are trying as much as possible to extend ICT or internet access and make sure that it respects human rights.
But these are limited
also,
groups.
Yes.
How do we reach wider numbers?
Well, in Eastern Africa, that brings in the issue of media. They're a key stakeholder in terms of being intermediaries for people who are still accessing information from traditional technologies like radio or print media, who are not, these populations are not necessarily online yet. So for us, it makes it very important to reach out to these groups, first as intermediaries, but also as people who are affected by some of these policies that are regressive. So for instance, there's stances from research or recommendations from research to do with policies that are not advocating for equitable access, will ensure that they also inform these minority groups or these affected groups on how to stay on the right side of the law. That includes things like digital safety. If a law is for instance, targeting media, ensure that the media and those targeted groups are very aware of ways to keep themselves safe and secure and responsible online, and not fall prone to the laws that have been passed.
Lynn, you work with governments, as we say, that have sometimes conservative. What has been their attitude?
What is what, sorry?
What's been their attitude when you come with suggestions?
That's a very far-reaching question.
And it's a broad one. It's a broad
I don't
one.
think I could fully
Are you
answer
finding easier acceptance? Are you finding a willingness to hear what you are finding in terms of your work with different communities that perhaps they don't deal with on a day-to-day basis, and just the experience yourself of for bringing in outside ideas?
Well, it really does vary from country to country. I mean, I would say that generally you will get governments that are willing to listen. Now, listening is one thing. Putting what has been communicated into action is entirely a different matter. I think in many of the countries in which we operate, there is a genuine interest in achieving certain levels of reform. All of the governments, I think, universally share concerns about providing access to people, about making sure...
Good concern, or concern that's based on worrying about their...
Connecting the unconnected.
Okay.
Connecting the unconnected. This is, we're constantly approached by the governments, I mean, not just us, all the operators, to improve the connectivity, to improve the reach, even though I would say in the region, for the most part, we've achieved some pretty remarkable success, even in war-torn countries such as Iraq. So I'm listening to what the other panelists are saying, and I understand the viewpoint, but I have to honestly say, in terms of our dialogues with the individual governments, the focus has been far more on improving service and connectivity and making sure people have access.
Yeah.
I would say in terms of using that then in terms of consultation with stakeholders and so on and so forth, that's still a relatively new concept in a lot of the countries in which we operate. But there is a very genuine concern on the part of most of the governments to improve the access. And where we have the dialogue is, although in